So this is Ruy Lopez move by move. Let me show you. E4. Why do you play e4? Why start with move? When you play e4, you're controlling the center. Also, you want to develop your bishop. So that's a very good move actually. Black plays here e5, and then you play knight f3. Why is knight f3 so common? Why is knight f3 better than other second moves here? When you play knight f3, you're developing, which helps you to castle, you're controlling the center, but probably more importantly, you're attacking the pawn on e5. So black should play something like knight c6, and then you can play bishop b5. And at this point, we have officially on the board Ruy Lopez opening. What's the idea of Ruy Lopez? Why is that a very common line? Why is Ruy Lopez or a Spanish game so interesting? Well, when you play bishop b5, you are developing, you are getting ready to castle, but probably the most interesting thing here is that you are taking the knight. And by taking the knight, you're removing the defender of the central pawn, so you might be able to capture that pawn in the future. At this point, black can play some moves. The main line is a6. We're going to talk about that. Other things you should know is that, black can play, for example, f5. That's a Sleeman. It's some kind of gambit or tricky line. Very interesting. Not precisely like strong, but interesting. Other lines here are knight e7 or knight f6 or d6. We're not going to talk too much about that, but you should know that those are possibilities for black. In the main line, black plays a6. This is Morphy defense. And here, we should play the move bishop to a4. That's the main line. You should know that bishop takes knight, removing the defender of the central pawn. It's not really getting the pawn right now, because if they capture and you capture here, they can play queen d4 with a fork. So that's why usually after the move a6, white actually plays just bishop to a4. Bishop takes knight is a theoretical line, very playable, but not with the idea of taking the pawn, just with the idea of developing and controlling the center very quickly. Bishop a4 is the main line. It's probably the best move here. Black plays here knight to f6 in the main line, and here white just castles. Why do they castle here? Well, again, we are not ready to play bishop takes knight. And knight takes pawn, because we're losing the pawn on e4 very easily with the same queen d4. And we don't want to keep the king in the center, so we need to castle. So, that's a very normal move in the opening. The rook gets better, the king also safer. I don't think we need to explain castling any further. So, okay, we castle. Also, something good about castling is that when black plays knight f6, they are attacking the central pawn. So, when you castle, you're getting ready to play rook e1 if they accept the challenge. So, this is not really very takeable. I mean, they can play it. It's actually a line. They can play knight takes e4, and that's what we call open Ruy Lopez. But it's not the most common line. The most common line here, the main line, is bishop to e7. So that's why castling is so important. And that's why black plays here, as I was saying, bishop to e7, instead of, b5 or knight takes pawn. So let's go bishop e7 main line. Here, we should play the move rook e1. One more time, we're not ready to capture the pawn. That's not really getting anything, because we're losing the pawn on e4. But after rook e1, your pawn is very well protected. So now you have a real threat. You are playing here bishop takes knight and knight takes pawn. That's why rook e1 is a very good move. It's main line here in Ruy Lopez. Here black should play the move b5. If they don't play it, you're getting one pawn. With bishop takes knight, knight takes pawn. So b5, you play bishop b3, you have no choice. We don't need to talk about that. It's the only move. Your bishop is super good on this diagonal, so keep that in mind. It can be important in Ruy Lopez games. Usually black plays d6 here in the main line, but you should know that black can play this line, castling. And if you continue with normal Ruy Lopez moves, let's say c3, they play d5. And this is what they call martial attack. Be aware of that. Martial attack is interesting and it's dangerous. So, it can happen. There are anti-martial systems. I don't want to talk about that too much, but you can avoid martial. Even when they castle directly to play d5, you can avoid it. I'm just going to say that. Well, in the main line, they don't castle and they just play d6. They are not really wanting to play d5. They just play d6, normal development, reinforcing the center. What do we play here? Well, you play the move here, c3. Why c3? Why is c3 a very important move in Ruy Lopez? Well, let me show you. You can play normal moves here like, knight c3 or d3. But that's not really getting any advantage, right? I mean, that's just creating a symmetrical position where you're just basically doing the same thing your opponent already has, right? Normal development, normal setup in the center. That doesn't really get any advantage. So we can do something that black cannot do, and it is to expand and put 2 pawns in the center. That's why the move c3 is so important here, because you are creating a center of 2 pawns with this idea. c3 is very strong. Another good thing about c3 is that you clear c2 for your bishop. That's an important thing, because also when they play d6, they are defending here, and as they are defending here, that means that they release the knight for other jobs, right? So the knight can go to a5 to get your bishop. That's another thing we should highlight. So c3 is a very important move after d6. c3 is a very important move, not only expanding, also clearing c2 for your bishop. Also dominating his knight. His knight cannot go ahead now. So usually black castles inside here. And the next move in Ruy Lopez is going to be h3. The idea of this move is that you want to prevent bishop g4. But why is that so important? I mean, why do you need to prevent bishop g4? Well, the idea is that you want to play d4, but you don't want to play d4 if you don't have good support here in the center. And the thing is that if you play d4 directly and they play bishop g4, they are taking here, and then they might be taking here if you capture on f3 with your queen. So that's like annoying. Again, you don't want to play d4 if you're not ready. You play only once you're ready. So h3 is a very typical move, something you need to do very often to prevent this when you're planning this kind of expansion in the center. In this kind of positions, h3 usually is fine. It is worse. The position is closed. You can lose a tempo to reinforce your position. It's fine. So h3 is actually correct here. And, well, this is a very critical moment in the theory of Ruy Lopez. Your opponent can play here like 3 main lines. Your opponent can play here knight a5. Your opponent can play here knight b8. That's a crazy move, right? I'm going to talk about that. And bishop b7. So this is main line knight a5. It's Chigorin defense. We're going to talk about that now. But first, let me show you. Knight b8. This is Breyer variation. Why knight b8? Well, they want to expand this pawn, right? They want to put the pawn on c5, and they want to rectify and put the knight on d7 instead. In that way, the knight supports here and here, and it's not blocking the bishop, which is going to be fine here on b7. So that's an idea. Again, remember the position is closed, so you can waste some tempo in there. It doesn't really affect that much. If you're actually improving, you can waste the tempo. That's the thing with closed positions. So that's the idea of this Breyer variation. Another line you should know. I mean, in Breyer you just play d4, right? Like normal moves here, 97, 92, nothing special. Another thing you should know is that they can play here bishop b7, and that's what we call Zaitsev variation. In Zaitsev, they are just trying to, put pressure on e4, and they are planning, like rook e8 and all that kind of move, where at some point, if they can open the e file, they might have good pressure in our center. So that's why this is the line. I mean, they are also just developing pieces, so it's a more or less natural move. So usually after bishop d7, you can play like d4, and they can play like rook e8, and then you can, reinforce your center with knight d2, and they can play like bishop f8, and you can play this typical move a4. In general, in Ruy Lopez, when your opponent has this structure, almost always, you're going to play a4 to fight that structure, create weaknesses, create problems, and to be annoying. You just play that move very often because you know it's annoying for your opponent. They cannot capture, because if they capture, they have a weakness here. So play that move. Usually that's a good thing for you in these kind of positions. So that's the idea with Zaitsev. Finally, we should talk about Chigorin. What happens in Chigorin? Well, they play knight a5 in Chigorin. And again, this is main line, okay? You should be very aware of this line because you're going to see it a lot. They will play it a lot. So what happens after knight a5? Well, very easy. They are taking your bishop, and you don't want to trade your bishop for his knight. Your bishop is great, right? So what do? We just go back for a moment. Bishop back to c2, also reinforcing the center. Maybe at some point the bishop can create some, some issue over there, or maybe you just come back later to b3. We don't know. But the thing is that you want to keep the bishop on the board. So we just play here bishop to c2, and at this point black plays the move c5. That's the idea of Chigorin, right? They put the knight on the edge to play the move c5, control very well here d4. Maybe later they can come back to better squares with the knight. But the thing is that they are controlling very well the center of the board. So after c5, you're going to play d4. They're not stopping you from doing this. They're just putting some pressure, but that's not really preventing your d4. So after d4, you have pressure here. They can play like queen c7, and you can play like normal development, right? Your queen side is undeveloped, so you need to make those pieces play. So you're going to play here knight b d2. I don't want to delay too much into Chigorin variation. I just want you to know that this is a very normal position. You're totally okay. Ideas like knight f1 are totally typical and are very well because your knight is coming to the king side, and also you can develop the bishop after that. Usually they will bring the knight back to c6, right, to put pressure there and force the knight, move the knight out of the edge of the board. So, well, that's the idea with Ruy Lopez. That's Ruy Lopez move by move. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. I'll catch you guys in the next.